Okay, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this panel in the FECAP International Conference organized by the Jean Monnet Chair. My name is Britta Weifen, or Bridget Weifen, as you can see on screen, and I'm going to chair this panel this afternoon. And the title of the panel is Regionalism Under Stress, and the original subtitle was actually Europe and Latin America in Comparative Perspective. We will have 4 speakers with us, who I'll just briefly introduce, and then I'll give a quick introduction into the topic of the panel, and then hand over to our speakers, each of which will have about 20 minutes. And then in the end, we'll have a final round of discussion, picking up questions from the audience, which you are invited to put into the chat already as we go through. Now, our panelists this afternoon, to start with, is Andrea Ribeiro Hoffmann, Professor of International Relations at Catholic University Rio de Janeiro, PUC-Rio, as it's known in Brazil. Then we have a little bit of a change of plan. Instead of Tanja Börzel, who is listed in the program, we'll have Thomas Risse with us, who is also a professor at Freie Universität Berlin, Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for Transnational Relations, Foreign and Security Policy, and is closely collaborating with Tanja on issues related to regionalism, to the topic of our panel. And so she sends her excuses. She has a competing commitment, and they have agreed that Thomas will deliver their joint contribution, in fact, to this panel. Our third speaker will be Andrés Malamud, who is originally from Argentina, but working for a long time already in Portugal as a senior research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon. And then last but not least, we will have Detlef Nolte, who many of you might have met personally on his many visits to Brazil over the past years before the pandemic, who is a professor of political science at the University of Hamburg and associate fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, and was formerly also director of the GIGA Institute of Latin American Studies. Now, all of these speakers of today are contributors to the book Regionalism Under Stress, Europe and Latin America in Comparative Perspective, which, well, happens to be the title of the book, but also the title of our panel today, which was edited by Detlef Nolte and myself. So this will we will draw this afternoon a little bit on this book, as well as on a recent article of Detlef and mine, published in the most recent issue of Revista Brasileira de Política Internacional, which deals with how regional organizations cope with recurrent stress, the case of South America. Now, what do we mean when we talk about stress or stress factors for regional organizations? That means we are talking about policy problems that can cause a crisis if they become more severe, if they endure over a longer time period, or if they accumulate and mutually reinforce each other. So that could be things like economic and financial crisis, security challenges, such as war and conflict in countries and within countries in a region, between countries in a region, or in the close neighborhood. Could be socio-cultural challenges, some of which might come up as a result of security questions and conflict, such as flows of migration that then leads to questions of, well, identity questions, questions of how to accommodate, integrate new arrivals in the country, might also be religious issues and things like that. We could have political challenges, such as political instability, coups or coup threats, threats to democracy, and last but not least, power shifts, the rise of emerging powers, contestations, such as now the rivalry between the United States and China that could influence policies in the region. So all of these we would consider as stress factors that could potentially challenge regional cooperation and regional organizations. And the question of how these organizations deal with and tackle such challenges depends a lot on what we have called in these publications region characteristics. So questions how well the region is already equipped with institutions, for instance, whether they are states that are willing to take the lead in fostering regional cooperation, whether there are strong interdependencies in the regions between states, and or whether there are fault lines, conflicts, cleavages within the region that impede cooperation, and also the question of whether both the political elites and the citizens do have a strong identity and identify with the region along with their national or local identification. So in all of these region characteristics can contribute to whether a regional organization is able to cope with stress and able to deal with stress, whether it is resilient or whether it is fragile and reacting negatively to stress in a way that the institutions are not able to cope and might even be further weakened or even challenged or even destroyed by these stress factors. And in our panel today, we are going to address these questions, these broad issues with relation to regional organizations in Europe and Latin America. And I asked the panelists in advance to address one or several of a number of questions in their statements. So which stress factors or crises have had an impact on regionalism in Europe and or in Latin America over the past 15 years? Can we compare the trajectory of regionalism or regionalisms in different world regions? So is the European Union, is it still to be considered a model both for the institutional design and for the study of regionalism in other world regions? Or is that no longer the case, or was it ever the case? And then last but not least, what are the future prospects for regional organizations in Europe and Latin America? So, and I'm very curious and looking forward to hear the contributions of our panelists who will speak in the order in which I have introduced them. So I'm happy to hand over now to Andrea Ribeiro-Hoffmann.
Thank you very much, Britta. It's really a pleasure to be with you here in this event organized by FECAP, by Claudia Marconini. It's really great. And with colleagues and friends now from exchanges about regional cooperation and regionalism. So when you sent this brief introduction, Britta, I thought, of course, I did contribute with the chapter on Mercosur to the book, but it's so much went through since then, since the publication, and yourself said that you published also an article now, you both about COVID. So what I thought is that I will address the last point. Now, what are the future prospects for regional organizations in Europe and Latin America? Focus, of course, Latin America and actually South America, but I will touch the other two questions. And for that, I'll just share my screen. Okay, so can you see the screen? Can you see the screen?
Yes,
okay,
we can.
Right, so,
so and maybe you can put it in full screen presentation mode if possible, so that's a bit bigger.
Oh, right. I have actually in my computer, but it's apparently not showing there. So I have a new computer. I think I won't lose time because I don't think I'll manage, but can you see at least the main one? Okay, good. So, and to answer that question, I'll focus on the experience of regional cooperation during COVID, but try to think about beyond COVID, but still focus on health as a driver. So the argument I'll be making here is that actually one of the elements that can bring through this crisis of regionalism in South America, again, I'm focusing South America, could be health. And in a way, like to do with stress, perhaps, health is not a bad element. So in my presentation, I'll just briefly, very briefly talk about how has been regional cooperation in health, and that has been dealt in the literature. And I'll also very briefly talk a little bit about the COVID vaccines, because I'll be focusing also in some elements of health that could be drivers of cooperation. And one of them is access to medicines, and COVID vaccines is an interesting case. So I talk a little bit about that, some data. And then I will talk about the regional responses in Latin America and the Caribbean to the COVID pandemic, to see to what extent during the pandemic, health was actually an issue area of cooperation. To what extent did it hold? And then I'll finish with the role of health, perhaps pushing forward future regional cooperation. Most of this research has been done also not only in the Mercosur chapter, but also some publications about regional health that have been engaged. And then moving to the regional cooperation in health. I mean, what we see is that health has been an issue area that has been object of cooperation, not only at the regional level. There is a global context in which, of course, since the creation of the UN, there is cooperation in health with the World Health Organization, but it's only in the 2000s that health become really an issue, become more politicized as well, and more visible in cooperation at the global level. So there is this term, global health revolution. UN system organizations beyond the WHO, the Health Organization, have dealt with issues related to health, even the Security Council. So health has become a key issue in global politics. There is also this concept of health diplomacy, the group of Oslo, that Brazil is also part, pushed to a large extent by Norway and France. And of course, there's a lot of NGOs and companies and foundations, such as the Melinda Gates Foundation, that you probably have heard about, their power in setting also the terms and sometimes solutions to global health issues. In the case of regional organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean, practically all regional organizations have dealt with health. They have created organs. There is an institutionalization of cooperation, both within the organization and also in their external relations. If we start with the Pan American Health Organization, it's not technically only a regional organization, but an organization that's part of the originally the Pan American introduction process, but then as a regional office to the World Health Organization. This institution is extremely active because there's several diseases and pandemic and endemic diseases in the American hemisphere that to start with yellow fever, and that has played a big role, for instance, the construction of the Panama Canal. So there's a lot of experience in health cooperation in the region. In Central America. Yes?
Andrea, sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if you're already advanced in the presentation, but we are still seeing the initial slide.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I think I'll stop here because I think what happened is that it changed to the other computer. So I start. Sim?
Acho que seria melhor se você compartilhar toda a sua tela, não só a janela do software.
Can you see
agora
it
sim,
now?
Agora foi.
Can you see it now? Okay, so I'm sorry. I was actually moving my screen. So I talked about the content. And I was talking now about the regional cooperation in health and in this global cooperation, the global context. And I was so now here in the regional organizations in Latin America and PAHO, the Office of the World Health Organization. And Central America, we have the System of Integration, the Central American, the CARICOM, and the Andean Community, Mercosur, and UNASUR. They all have institutions, and they have to deal with regional with health in the last years and decades. And key themes in this cooperation have been a lot, of course, systems of information, vigilance, capacity building, social determinants of health. And I will highlight here access to medicaments, where these organizations have discussed and formulated norms, but also even negotiated issues related to intellectual property patents in medicines, and also joint negotiations and acquisitions of medicaments. And so I'll briefly go now to this data about COVID and vaccines to see to what extent the vaccine, the kind of medicaments dealt in the pandemic, they trigger or they dealt with these organizations. So very briefly, I mean, Latin America is, of course, not on the front line of having already access to vaccines, but it's not also in the bottom line, as you can see here. I mean, it's most Latin American countries have been quite well covered by now, if you compare especially with Africa, but very unequally also within the countries and within regions in the country. Sometimes big cities have been already have their third doses, and some interior cities, they have none. So, of course, the levels of death is extremely high, such as in Brazil, for instance. And what kind of vaccines are being used in Latin America? I mean, most existing vaccines, you can see here that some of these vaccines are bought directly, but some come through the COVAX initiative, multilateral initiative, but basically you have all vaccines that have been produced. COVAX, as you know, is this initiative that buys and distributes vaccines all over the world. You can follow that. I'll go very quickly here, but you can follow that to what extent vaccines are being delivered in all those countries, and I was following that very closely. But here I'll just very briefly present. And CEPAL, ECLACNA has also a very good database to follow the vaccination pace and the kinds of vaccines. So moving back now to what have regional organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean done related to health during the pandemic. Of course, I mean, most of these organizations, and especially if we focus on South America, they were already in crisis. And if you talk about Mercosur and UNASUR, they did have a lot of initiatives before, but they were completely outside the handling of COVID in the region. But we did have some initiatives, I mean, in Central America by SICA and CARICOM, mainly organized based on external donations, EU and Japan. So they were able, through their institutions, to canalize and redistribute these medicines. CELAC, especially under the presidency of Mexico, try to coordinate, but also coordination of donation. And Mexico and Argentina had this bilateral cooperation to try to do a joint production of AstraZeneca. But this has been all very, very not only thin, but again, basically the coordination of distribution of donation. So when we're talking about cooperation before, where UNASUR and Mercosur, what they were doing was actually thinking about and doing for some examples of high expensive medicaments to do with HIV and hepatitis in the past. They were actually trying to negotiate these medicines together. So they were trying to not only, in some cases, even break patents. That was also considered in the case of COVID, supported by Biden in a certain moment, but also buying together so they would pay less for the medicaments. And so what we see here is, again, regional organizations able to coordinate distribution of donations. They were not able to try to pay better prices or to break patents and be able to distribute those medicaments in the region. And moving here now to this future prospects. I mean, if we look at the scenario of crisis of regionalism, again, that was already before COVID, the crisis of multilateralism also feeds into that. We have, in terms of external federators to regionalism in Latin America and the Caribbean, and especially the role of the EU in the past, that has been very important to promote, to support, or to exchange with regional organizations. What we see is that decreased in the last years, and even with CELAC now, CELAC has been dealing more with China than with the EU. And even in COVID, I mean, there were some distributions also, as I mentioned, through the in the leadership of Mexico, of donations from China to the region. So, I mean, we have this scenario of crisis of multilateralism, and as we know, many countries in Latin America, especially in the case of Brazil, also reduction of the role of regional integration, or even the region in its external relations and foreign policy. And in that sense, Latin America has been revived a bit of the scenario of the Cold War. Many countries reliant on China for either investments or exports, but at the same time, in this context, also afraid of becoming over-reliant, as in previous times with other external countries as well. In the region itself, I mean, traditional countries who have projects and promoted regional integration and had leadership, such as Venezuela or even Brazil. As you know, Venezuela is still in its permanent crisis for over a decade and completely unable to do any leadership in regional integration. And Brazil, the same thing for, ironically, also with a populist government, but on the extreme right. And Bolsonaro has, during his governance, that's still 1 year to go, underplayed Latin America, even in its Brazilian external relations at all. I mean, as you know, even Mercosur, it's probably rolling back as a result of this abandonment of Brazilian foreign policy to this organization. So there's no leadership there. And I argue even more that there is this damage will go beyond Bolsonaro. I mean, this lack of, this break of trust in the engagements in the region and also outside the region will probably endure in the next decade. So there's no foreseen leadership. Of course, there is some leadership of so-called middle powers in PROSUR and Pacific Alliance and Chile. And but of course, if you want to engage all big countries, I mean that I see as a problem. Of course, the lack of engagement of Brazil or Venezuela, for instance. And so to conclude, I mean, I'm putting out this argument that health could be a driver, because in this geopolitical scenario and the presence of China to this level and lack of big, strong leadership in the region, I mean, some perhaps cooperation could endure, and in that sense, some kind of a resistance to those stress factors could be some element of resilience if some issue areas at least keep alive the seed of cooperation. And of course, there is a legacy of ISAGs, especially in South America, despite of course, the dismissal of UNASUR. There are a lot of networks and epistemic communities in health that they stand before even ISAGs of this tradition of health cooperation from the Pan-American Health Organization. In Brazil, for instance, we have two strong institutes, Fiocruz and Instituto Butantan in São Paulo, who have also been the leading institutions in managing to have a vaccination at all in Brazil. As you know, that the federal level didn't put forward any policy to implement a response to COVID, and it was thanks to the regional level and governmental level, and here these national institutes that there was at all. And those institutes are an example of cooperation on health. Fiocruz did, both organizations did agreements with transfer of technology, Fiocruz with AstraZeneca, Instituto Butantan with CoronaVac, and they were able to produce the first vaccines. And of course, now other vaccines, and especially Pfizer, have been also sold to the country. So in the case of other Latin American countries, there's no national production. So most countries depend on donation, depend on import, and paying the prices of this medicine. So here, just to finish, I mean, of course, in South America, as there is no UNASUR anymore, I mean, the question is whether Mercosur could bring this experience to health to a fruitful regional cooperation. And I must say, I went with a very skeptical tone. Again, I mean, Mercosur, the last couple of weeks, and I mean, it has been still undermined by Bolsonaro's foreign policy, and the idea of having rolling back Mercosur to a free trade area is very concrete. So I think here, I mean, I'll just finish with the idea that perhaps these networks and epistemic communities will have to endure longer to be able to be fruitfully engaged in initiatives of regional integration. But at least there is the Pan-American Health Organization in terms of delivering health to the citizens of the region. But regional integration as such, in my view, it's still lagging some years to go to be able to pick up again. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the, the technical confusion.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And indeed, I didn't mention it explicitly in my introduction, but obviously health crisis, as we all know by now, can also be a stress factor, well, not only for us as individuals, but for societies and also for international cooperation and international organizations. So thank you very much for this look at Latin America in that respect, and how the health crisis, how the pandemic has been managed by various regional institutions. So with this, I would like to hand over to our next speaker, Thomas Risse.
Okay, thank you, Britta. It's great to see you all, some very familiar faces, some other people I don't know, but it's really great to be here. And as you see, I am not Tanja Börze, even though Tanja talked to me occasionally. And so what I'm going to do is, this is a co-production, because Tanja wrote down some bullet points for me. And I added some, and in fact, I'll do a bit, because I thought Andrea's talk was very, very inspiring and very interesting, and particularly all the information. And you know, I could add on this. Nevertheless, I would really like to answer Britta's questions, you know, one by one. So the first question is, which stress factors or crises have had an impact on regionalism in Europe and or Latin America over the past 15 years? So since there are many more people in the room who know Latin America inside out, I'm not even there to speak about Latin America and leave that up to you. So I'm going to concentrate on Europe. My first, it's more a conceptual remark. If we think of crisis or stress factors, etc., we usually think about crisis or stress as unraveling an order or having kind of negative consequences. Of course, also the opposite can happen. You know, I mean, what Andrea just reported from Latin America in response to the health crisis is by the way, you have a severe crisis, but it actually also fosters at least some cooperation. So given that, Europe, I mean, for the past 15 years, Europe underwent one crisis after the other. You know, we were just done with one, then the next one comes. So it started with the so-called Euro crisis. We've by now almost forgotten about it, but that almost killed the entire Eurozone, the zone of the single currency. This was quickly when we were over with that one. We faced the so-called, what was sometimes some people called migration crisis or migration challenges. We had barely survived that, and we still it's still coming. We currently have a serious crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border with what one could call the weaponization of migration by both Russia and Belarus. So migration is an ongoing issue. Then it's almost forgotten by now, but Brexit happened. So for the first time, a country actually left the European Union, bye-bye, and so forth. We have a rule of law crisis that is still ongoing. I mean, the EU praises itself as being a club of liberal democracies. We have at least 2 countries, but even some more, that are seriously challenging the rule of law foundation, which is kind of really constitutive for the European Union, and that is an ongoing stress level. So we had our fair share of crisis and stress. My argument with these crises would be they've done 2 things. They have fueled the politicization of EU affairs, and that was driven mostly by kind of nationalist, authoritarian, populist movements and leaders that were mobilizing what we call a new conflict line or new cleavage against the EU. So if the EU stands for kind of liberal identity, liberal values, cosmopolitan ideas, etc., they were promoting rather nationalist, authoritarian, and xenophobic, anti-migration, etc. ideas. So, so this politicization, the content, if you want, is really about identity politics in the European Union. So identity is the question: who are we? You can talk about the Brexit crisis and the migration challenges as who belongs to us? Do you want to be part of the member? Is that us or is it them, etc.? I mean, Britain decided they're more on the other side, so they went out. But also the whole way migration was discussed is really about an idea of Europe as a kind of multicultural place, open to all ethnic identities, religious identity, etc., or is Europe a kind of bunch of Judeo-Christian fortress? Never mind that a lot of these right-wing nationalists are also deeply anti-Semitic, by the way, but nevertheless they were pushing this idea of Europe as a bunch of where Christianity was constructed as a kind of really exclusionary kind of system, and that was at the bottom of the migration crisis. Interestingly enough, the COVID thing was, of course, a major stress level for the EU, but it actually led to some very interesting policy changes that were unimaginable 15 years ago. One thing, I mean, just to add on to Andrea, the EU did jointly negotiate with the various vaccination companies, with BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca, etc. They negotiated joint prices, so and plus the distribution. The Germans were actually pretty mad at the beginning of the year about this, because had the EU not done this, we Germans would have been vaccinated much earlier. So we simply had to wait. So, but that's the price you pay for solidarity. Equally important, Europe, of course, as everybody, has been faced with an enormous economic crisis as a result of COVID, and here a major policy change took place. It stimulated another integration step. For the very first time, the European Union can now raise a collective debt. Not very much, but it can do it. And the same is true. There is some sort of European tax by now. It's very minimal, very small, but if you compare that with the EU reaction to the Euro crisis, when it was all about Greece, Italy, and so forth, particularly the Germans, were completely opposed to anything like collective debt. And that has changed. There's a turnaround. It's almost, I would call it a turnaround by 180 degrees. My fellow German citizens haven't probably not found out yet. because we didn't have big riots on this. But I mean, it was, you know, it's a major turnaround. And again, it shows you that sometimes something good comes out of these crises. Okay, so this is my answer to the first question. The next one is on the, can we compare the trajectory of regionalism in different world regions? Is the EU still a model both for the institutional design and for the study of regionalism? Now, we weren't sure, Tanya and I weren't sure whether that question was meant in a normative way or in a more analytical way. If you put it in normative terms, I'd say no, why should Europe and the EU be a normative model to aspire? Other regions of the world have probably different issues. I mean, talk about, for example, talk about Sub-Saharan Africa. Regional organizations there face very different issues from the EU. A lot of violence, civil war, transnational violence, as a result of which they actually have much stricter or much more intrusive rules about military humanitarian interventions and that kind of thing rather than the EU. So normatively speaking, I think the EU is not a model and should not be a model. Empirically, of course, we can compare the EU with all kinds of other regional organizations. In a way, the EU stands out because in terms of both the depth and the breadth of regionalism and regional integration, the EU is pretty special, but also in terms of the intrusiveness in the domestic affairs of the various countries. So in that sense, you can compare the EU, of course, according to these various dimensions to other regional organizations. And one of the real puzzling issues is that if you do that, then and this comes to the second point for the study of regionalism. If you only study European regionalism, you know, we have these standard theories of integration, and most of them argue, okay, it all starts with economic interdependency, and economic interdependency creates conflicts. And in order to deal with these conflicts peacefully, you need regional institutions, etc., etc. That's the regional integration story. And it is irrespective of whether you follow kind of Ernst Hasse's neo-functionalism or more Andy Moravcik's liberal intergovernmentalism. On this point, they are all the same. Now, if you put that in different regions of the world, you'll find out immediately, whoops, doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Africa is a good example. You have very integrated regional organizations without much economic interdependence, because sub-Saharan African countries still trade mostly with the global north. Go into East Asia, you see the opposite. You have you have much, in some respect, actually more economic interdependence than you have in Europe, but far less integration. So in fact, comparing, this is sort of the plea for comparisons, comparing can tell you something about the validity of the various theories. So last question is, I'm running out of time. Last question and what are the future prospects of regional organizations in Europe and Latin America? Okay, I don't say anything about Latin America here, you know, so Europe. So on the one hand, regionalism and the EU is by now, I call it part of the furniture. Tanya wrote down part of the DNA, but that's about the same. Yeah, it's deeply inscribed. You can see it, you know, it's just natural at the moment. If you watch nightly news in Germany, you know, it changes between German news and European news almost instantaneously, and it's just part of the who we are. Has to do, of course, with overcoming World War I and the nationalist part of Europe. But I think one of the issues is still Europe moves very, very slowly, sometimes too slowly, but it has sort of an experience of decades of collective problem solving through regional organizations. And I think COVID-19, okay, the glass, we can always come up with stuff that didn't work, but COVID-19 is another example for the response was late, but as always, the EU, if you have 28 member states, they all want to be heard, etc. So it takes time, it is cumbersome, and somebody is always disappointed by the results, but it moves, you know. So so to come back to the first question, stress, crises happen, but they can also lead to progress. In fact, I have two major, and now I switch to normative issues. I have two major concerns with Europe and the EU. One is the rule of law issue. The issues we're currently facing with both Poland and Hungary are serious. They get to the core of what is the EU's core identity as a bunch of liberal democracies, where with the rule of law, human rights, and the rest of it. And the other is the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening at the EU borders. You know, currently, and still, I mean, this is not a crisis that the EU fabricated. This is a weaponization of interdependence by Belarus and by Russia, but it amounts in the end to a humanitarian catastrophe if you have 3,000 people camping out in kind of winter-like conditions at the Polish-Belarusian border. And let's not forget what is still happening in the Mediterranean. And that again raises some issues about Europe as a kind of normative. It used to be called normative power. I don't like that term at all. But you know, it does challenge us Europeans as far as our moral values, etc., is concerned when we keep people drowning in the Mediterranean. So I'll stop here. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this insightful comments with a specific focus on the European Union and the European context, which I think is very interesting for our audience. So thank you very much for that. And I now hand over to the next speaker, Andres Malamud.
Thank you, Britta. I am very happy to be here, even though I am deeply jet-lagged, but I'll try to be clear. I will be speaking about concepts, and I will be showing you some maps. But the concepts are key, because I will claim that stress depends on where you are. There is contingent stress, as in Europe, and there is structural stress for regionalism, as in Latin America. And where you are is fundamentally north or south. I am not discovering America here, but the thing is that regionalism in the global south is much different from regionalism in the global north than we thought. But what are the concepts that I am using to compare? It's about flows and rules. Thomas and Tanya have worked about this, regionalization and regionalism. Do they correspond to each other? Does regionalism, that is common rules, increase when regionalization, that is more flows, increase? And they have shown that not necessarily. There are regions that are like Europe, in which you have more regionalized, higher level of regionalizations, flows, and higher levels of regionalism. rules. And this is the thing, you need common rules when you have common flows, when you are doing things with your neighbor, or there are people doing things across the border. And the things you can do with your neighbor are war, trade, or crime, to mention the more important ones. And what is evident by now is that the Northerners, the global North, is doing a lot of trade, while the global South is not. We are more kind of trading with crime, especially in Latin America. So the rules we need are very different from those the North need. And let me share the screen to make things more confusing. This is a little bit about the chapter I published with Eduardo Viola in the book edited by Brita and Detlef. Shortly, this is the way we usually look at the world. We think in terms of regions. This comes natural to us. But this is another way of looking at the world. And this is about flows, trade flows. As you can see, if we take the United States, Germany, and China, that is the top exporters in the world, we conclude that Germany and the United States are two large regional powers, while China is the only global power. And this is very important because China is kind of integrating the southern regions with an external hub. The core of Africa, the core of most of South America when it comes to trade is out of the regions. It's in Asia, Asia Pacific. And this has consequences because remember, rules follow flows. What is the global structure that we are seeing right now? What are the theories? What are the theories telling us we should expect? As of realism, realism doesn't have much to say about regionalism, except for alliances. But the main concept I want to emphasize here is the stopping power of water. So the idea is that flows stop at the water, trade and war and crime. As to liberalism, well, the idea is borders are less and less relevant because we are doing things with the others, irrespective of borders. So flows do not stop at borders. There are more flows. The borders are physical, I mean. So these constitute land masses, continental regions. And finally, constructivism, this could be more global, but we know that identities, collective identities are mostly rooted territorially. And look at the name of the most, well, global one, the Western culture, the Western identity, it's in the West. It's territorially located from the name itself. So all these theories are expecting that regions are going to be important because the water and the land masses define what we do and how we think. So forget about multilateralism. This is the other part of the chapter I will not be referring to. But regionalism is thought as an efficient way of administering and managing increasing flows. Very fast about this. This is the sticks. This is the first dimension of power. This is the capacity of power projection of every country in the world. This is just about aircraft carriers. How far can you go to make someone do something that he or she wouldn't have done otherwise? Well, all the aircraft carriers in the middle are the United States, nuclear propelled. All those in the left are amphibious, and all those on the right are the rest of the world. There is one Brazilian aircraft carrier there. It's no longer here. It was decommissioned years ago. So in the south, there is nothing similar to this that the Northerners have. But this is more important, the second dimension of power, the economy, the carrot. Most of the flows in the world are northern. In the south, you can see a few maritime shipping routes, but mostly they go back to the north once they have gone through the Good Hope Cape or the Magellan Cape. This is very well known for all of us, but sometimes we forget and we apply the same concepts. Concepts are point for traveling. This is okay. But the thing is that once they travel, they have to take routes. Otherwise, they are not going to be capable to explain the new reality they found. And this is about population or demography. And here again, we find an asymmetry. What's the asymmetry? The density of population and density of interactions. Europeans live all together. Asians live all together, or at least very close one to the other. While in mostly South America, not Central America, but South America, people live far away from each other. So land masses here divide people instead of putting people together. And just to check on whether geography defines integration. This is the European Union as it was before. It's 27, but not because Brexit, but because in this old map, Croatia was not there yet, and the United Kingdom was still there. But the important thing here is that you can see Cyprus here, full member, and you can see Brazil here, which is not a member, but it's together, it's side by side with French Guiana. This is the European Union as we know it, but this is not the European Union as we thought of it before it became what it is. Let me show you how I know this. This is the Eurobill, which was depicted in the 2000. Brazil is still here because French Guiana is there, but Cyprus is not here. The guys that thought of Europe, the guys that thought of the Euro, had no idea that Cyprus would ever become a member of the European Union and of the Eurozone itself. So this Eurobill is no longer in circulation. If you go to your pocket, you will find a different design here. But this is how they thought of Europe 5 years before Europe changed. So geography is not that important because Cyprus is fully Asian, while French Guiana is fully American. Geography is very important, but there are things that are more important than geography, and these, I contend, are flows. And flows in the past depended on geography, but today they are depending less and less on geography. They are depending on seas, oceans, rather than land masses. I will show you the consequence now, and then I will come back to the causes. The consequence is that in Europe, where you have demographic density and you have tons of common flows, 66% of intra-regional trade interdependence. This means that European countries conduct trade with their neighbors before they do with their non-neighbors. And so functional integration is about concentricity. Everybody but Britain wants to converge into the center, into the core. Latin America is the other way around. There is no core. Mexico and Brazil may be small cores for sub-regions, but there is nothing like a joint core. There is nothing like joint rules because there is nothing like common flows. It's very, very, very little what Mexico trade with South America, for example. Mexico is very much dependent on the North American market, and South America is more and more dependent on China's market. And the consequence is that regionalism in Latin America is not a mechanism to reduce complexity, but it is a mechanism to reproduce complexity. There are as many regional organizations in Latin America as there are countries. And most of them do not work or are very cheap and work very little. This is just a brief comparison about personnel and budget. These are really cheap organizations. Most things are done by the member states. Personnel also depends on the member states. There is nothing like Brussels in Latin America, a place where money is spent and people is hired and things are done. And this has a reason. And the reason is that these countries are more and more fragmented by the oceans rather than brought together by the oceans. You may think of NATO. yeah, NATO was a means by which North America was able to defend Europe from the Soviets. But we don't refer to NATO as regional integration. Well, in the case of South America, I will contend that the oceans are bringing together shores of different continents rather than land masses, as for example, here. So PACA, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this organization. It's not really very important. But the thing is that there are people thinking of regions in terms of oceans, not land masses. And oceans bring together shores, but they fragment land masses at the same time. Not to speak of this, probably the first regional organization in Latin America that has an ocean in the name instead of the continent. This is not about Latin America, this is about the Pacific, because they are looking into Asia, mainly China, but not only China. So against what we thought before, against the expectation of the main theories, it's not about land borders bringing countries together, and it's not about oceans separating countries, but it's about oceans bringing countries together and land borders separating countries. Such as in here, this is a map. This is the way we built the map, by opening the economy in the case of the Pacific countries, or keeping it closed in the case of the Atlantic countries. So we can see divergence and fragmentation, which fits the heterogeneity that was already there at the beginning of the story. Let's keep this. This is Brazil, the largest Latin American country. And what we see here is that Brazil's export structure changed a lot in the last 70 years, from being basically a commodity exporter to being a manufacturer exporter in the 90s, then back to commodity exporter. And the reason is, who is Brazil selling to? And the answer is not its neighbors. It's mainly China. This is old, this is a decade old now, but right now, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, China grew in importance, not only for Brazil, but also for Argentina and the rest of the Latin American countries. So these countries trade with each other less than before and more with China. This is not, well, this is happening in Europe as well. But the thing is that Europe trades so much with it, within Europe, that the importance of China is relative. About identity, many people thought, for post-functionalist theories, that identities are important, identities and values, and they are, but as differently from the past, we now think that identities divide rather than bring people together. This is just a map of smaller minority identities in Europe, and these are against integration in their nation states. Mostly these identities, sub-regional identities, are in favor of uniting the region, but not the states. So they build kind of bridges between the subnational region or nation and Europe. But in any case, they are not the engine behind integration. In Latin America, something similar is happening. Latin Americans are very closely related as regards history and traditions and values. And yet this is not enough of an engine to foster integration. So what we see is that the world is not about to be taken by regions. The United Europe, the European Union still is the only one that is significant in the world scene. As for the rest, this is becoming, or has become, a world of acronyms or a Jew world. The organization is not about the WTO or the United Nations. It's about small groups of countries that do things together or try to do things together. The most important one is the last one, the G2, US and China. And here there are two important conclusions. First, global multilateralism is not working. Second, neither is regionalism. This is all about countries trying to cooperate. But these countries are on their own. They do not come in representation of regions. And again, This is partly because oceans are becoming the core of interaction. This is not fully so, and here comes what is more important for Latin America in the future to come. What we do with each other is not trade. What we do with each other in Latin America is not war. What we do with each other is crime. The cartels are supranational, or at least transnational. The governments, the countries, are national by definition. So the flows that are invading, that are taking charge of Latin America are illicit. Regionalization is illicit, mostly. So regionalism is unable to cope with this illicit regionalization, because by definition, regionalism is something done by the states with public signatures of international treaties. So we have a problem here. We have illicit flows, and we have licit rules that are unable to control these flows. We are losing the war against the cartels, and we are not building flows of trade instead, because trade is going out of the region. And this is the last one. This is just to show you the real information about this. This is a McKinsey report of 2019, the last year before the pandemic, and their conclusion in written was that regionalism and regionalization was increasing in the world. But this was a chart that they themselves inserted that shows that this is not true. Regionalism are not advancing in the world. They are advancing in the north mostly. While in the south, well, this is not tidy. You can see NAFTA, there are some problems there. But mostly, there is a split between regions that are increasing their level of regionalizations and regions that are decreasing their level of regionalization. So a common recipe that is regionalism is not going to work. In fact, it is not working. I'm not doing something normative here. Britta mentioned UNASUR. I think Detlef is going to speak about that. Also Andrea. UNASUR is no longer there. Mercosur is still there, but it doesn't work, really. So what we see is that rules are not working. So regional organizations that were built in order to manage flows are disappearing. We are focusing on Latin America. We can go with the same story in Africa, some parts of Asia. It's not exactly the same, but just to close up. We have to put an eye on illicit flows. And maybe we have to take into account this Jorge Garzón wrote about of decoupling, the decoupling of regionalism. If we insist on regionalism with economic ends, we are going to end up without economic flows, but with lots of illicit flows that are going to be unrulable and unstoppable. Cartels are stronger than states in Latin America. If we still insist with all recipes, we are going to be demolished by what is coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andres. A very, very interesting perspective, very interesting take, challenging a bit this kind of idea of geographically homogeneous and closely working together regions. So thank you very much for that. And I think there will be the opportunity to discuss that, and I'm sure there will be some questions to you as well from the audience. And I use that as an opportunity to encourage and invite the audience again to drop questions in the chat. As we mentioned, they can also be in Portuguese. I speak Portuguese quite well, and some of the panelists do too. And so that shouldn't be a problem, and we will translate then into English. Yeah, so the next speaker is going to be Detlef Nolte, and I'm handing over to you, Detlef.
Thank you, Britta, for the invitation. And so it's a real pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues. I will try to answer your questions. Perhaps I will start with the second one, then I will continue with the third. And if there's some time left, I will say also something in regard to the first question. The second one was about the EU as a model. I think that the EU is still a model for a certain type of regionalism, which combines a high degree of regionalization and deep integration with strong and supranational institution. And if a region decides to take this path and the necessary prerequisites are in place, the EU is a model. If a region decides to take another path, then the EU is not a model. From this perspective, I think we can compare the trajectories of regionalism in different world regions, as also Thomas Risser has mentioned. But we must take into account that the trajectories are different, which means that regionalism has different objectives and different structures. We cannot take European regionalism as the benchmark and to analyze whether other types of regionalism correspond or deviate from this benchmark. This said, we should therefore differentiate between different types of regionalism. But to come back, or to include the first question, we can also ask which region and thus which kind of regionalism has weathered better the stress tests of different stress. If that is Europe and the European Union, then the question could be raised in other regions as to whether to make it sense, it is desirable, and whether the necessary prerequisites exist to emulate the European model. And even if European regionalism is different from regionalism in Latin America, it is possible that concepts and research tools developed for the study of the European Union can travel across the Atlantic, but it should be the right concepts and tools, and these usually have to be adapted to the Latin American context. And I think in the book chapter, I mentioned some examples. What about the future prospects for regional organization in Europe and Latin America? I will not speak about Europe because Thomas has much more expertise than I on this topic. I will refer to Latin America. My view about the future of regional institutions in Latin America is quite skeptic. Regional institutions have to survive in a quite difficult economic environment. Even before the pandemic hit Latin America in the period from 2014 to 2019, the annual regional GDP growth rate was only 0.4%. And after the 2020 slump caused by the pandemic, most Latin American economies will not return to the pre-pandemic level until next year. And medium-term growth forecasts from different international institutions are rather modest for Latin America. Latin American regionalism, as has been mentioned also before, traditionally exhibited comparative low levels of economic regionalization in contrast to the European Union or Asia, as countries have much stronger extra-regional economic connections, as Andres has shown us. According to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, since 2010, Latin America and the Caribbean has been undergoing a process of trade decoupling. In 2019, the year before the pandemic started, inter-regional trade accounted for less than 15% of Latin American trade. And for most sub-regional groupings, such as the Mercosur, inter-bloc trade shares had been lower. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit Latin America in 2020, inter-regional trade collapsed more than extra-regional trade and reached a new low of 12% of total trade, and temporarily even fell to 9% in the case of Mercosur. In 2021, this year, Latin America's exports rebounded, mainly to the increase in exports to Asia, especially to China, and the increase in raw material prices. Intra-regional trade has also increased, especially in manufacturing, and could reach the level of 2019 in 2021. But even in this positive scenario, Latin America continues to show a low level of economic interdependence as a basis for economic integration. The strong dependency on exports and imports outside the region persists. In this sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of Latin American regionalism and reinforced its structural limitations. On the one hand, the weak material basis for economic creation has become further debilitated during the COVID-19 crisis or challenge. On the other hand, the negative economic incentives for regional cooperation unfold in an increasingly difficult political environment, characterized by political and ideological polarization and a lack of regional leadership. Brazil, under Bolsonaro, as has been mentioned before, is not interested in regional leadership, and Mexico's current claim for a leadership role might end after its pro tempore presidency of CELAC. Most Latin American governments are absorbed by domestic problems, with not much leeway for regional activism. In some cases, the regional initiatives mainly serve domestic political purposes, such as in Mexico, also in Argentina, which calls into question their continuity and sustainability. Presidential activism had been necessary to overcome some of the structural constraints of Latin American regionalism, a topic that has been broadly discussed and elaborated by Andres Malamud. Latin American regionalism is both intergovernmental and interpresidential. This has given impetus to regional integration in times of strong presidential leadership and political affinities among presidents. However, these characteristics of Latin American regionalism have led to blockades, delays in times of polarization and lack of political consensus. Changes in governments are changing regional dynamics more than in Europe, as the examples of Mexico and Argentina recently demonstrated, where with a change of government to López Obrador and Fernández, also the political orientation with regard to regional integration projects changed. Political polarization and incompatible ideas about the direction of regional integration have led to the current crisis of Latin American regionalism. There is little evidence that ideological positions have converged and that Latin America is going through a process of depolarization. The already light institutional structure of Latin American regionalism has been weakened even more since the first decade of the 21st century. In a recent article in Latin American Policy, I described current Latin American regionalism as low-profile regionalism, paraphrasing Alberto Hirschman, low costs of exit and low incentives for voice and loyalty. But I also agree with the characterization of current Latin American regionalism by Mariano Presan and Luciano in the Revista Brasileira de Política Internacional in a recent just published article, which characterized the current situation as liquid regionalism. And I quote, which is characterized by the low commitment of actors, especially governments and state actors, which has reinforced the idea that regional norms and structures are volatile and changeable, designed not to crystallize or perpetuate themselves. They continue, liquid regionalism leads to a dangerous cyclical dynamic, developing lighter, more flexible and dynamic processes, encourages less regional commitments, which in turn increases insecurity within integration process. I think this is a very good characterization of the current situation in Latin America. Looking back, Ana Ayuso had argued that there was too many regionalisms and there was too little regionalization in Latin America. But I would say now the situation is worse. Regionalization has continued to decline, and there are now no new regional projects, while the old ones have lost their appeal. The division in Latin America between authoritarian regimes of different political colors and democracies could deepen even further and make political cooperation in the region more difficult. The great challenge for Latin American multilateralism and regional integration processes is that there is no common position towards the subversion of democracy and authoritarian regimes in the region. This applies to both left and right authoritarian tendencies. The views of governments are polarized and biased according to the political orientation. For example, the Argentinian President Alberto Fernández criticized the violence against protesters in Colombia in May, but was silent on the protests in Cuba or the situation in Venezuela, and ambivalent in regard to Nicaragua. The discussion must continue on how the Latin American regional architecture can be made more stress-resistant, to come back to the first question. Precisely because presidential diplomacy and conflicts between the presidents have contributed to the crisis of Latin American regionalism, consideration should be given to how regional organizations can be shielded to a certain extent against the spillover of conflicts between the presidents. One possibility would be to build stronger supranational institutions. This path is quite unlikely for Latin America. A strategy to shield regional substructures is more realistic. In order to achieve more continuity in regional cooperation, it will be necessary to give priority to technical rather than dogmatic questions. For example, in the case of the Latin American and Caribbean Space Agency launched as part of CELAC. A technical scientific multilateralism, to quote Tom Liegler, based on functional cooperation could help to sidestep political ideological disagreements among governments. The question is whether this is possible and whether it is a realistic option. The region is currently moving between two poles or approaches of regionalism. A pragmatic approach, which, regardless of the ideological orientation of the governments, strives for results-oriented cooperation in certain political and economic areas, and a declaratory regionalism that is ideologically oriented and has a strong domestic political component. Some Latin American forums and organizations, such as CELAC, combine both with an open outcome as to what kind of cooperation will gain the upper hand. So I think there's still some time left to say also something to the first question. I think what Thomas forgot at the beginning, both regions had also to confront the financial crisis. This goes before the Euro crisis. But I think this crisis affected Europe much more than Latin America for various reasons, because European banks were more exposed. And there have been also stricter regulations for the financial sector in many Latin American countries as a result of earlier crises in the financial sector. I think there has also been nothing comparable to the Euro crisis in the EU in Latin America for obvious reasons: no delegation of sovereignty and no common currency. The stress or the crisis caused by migration flows have been mentioned. We have this on both sides of the Atlantic. In the case of Europe, they were basically caused by the civil war in Syria and led to tensions between the member countries due also to the Schengen Agreement. In the case of Latin America, it was primarily a question of the political induced migration of Venezuelans, which did not affect the regional organization as far as I remember, but was mainly approached as a national problem of the affected recipient countries. At the same time, the political crisis in Venezuela and the different reactions of the other Latin American governments impaired regional cooperation. We had Brexit in Europe, and we had, as some authors called it, Southern exit in Latin America, which means the disintegration of UNASUR, with 7 to 8 countries withdrawing. We still not know which countries finally withdraw and which are still in a part in, but I think the organization is dead. I think both exits are difficult to compare in regard to their repercussions, but one can argue, and I would agree with Thomas in this, that Brexit in a certain way has strengthened the European Union in contrast to Southern exit, which has weakened South American regional cooperation, because there's no UNASUR, and especially now in the pandemic, it would have been an advantage to have more cooperation in the health sector. I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic revealed weaknesses in regional institutions in Europe and Latin America, but ultimately also led to strong counter-reactions in Europe, as mentioned by Thomas, with regard to economic stabilization and also to revitalization measures. In Latin America, many regional organizations underperformed. I do not think that the COVID-19 stress strengthened regional institutions in Latin America, and this, I disagree a little bit with Andrea. It gave some new life to CELAC, but it remains to be seen whether CELAC will be consolidated in the future again. The nationalist right, also mentioned before by Thomas, identitary politics. Some authors call it also the neo-patriotic right in Latin America, is a challenge for multilateralism and thus also for regional organization in Europe and Latin America. In this regard, I think the challenge for the European Union is greater, as the competences of supranational bodies are called into questions by these movements. The institutions of intergovernmental Latin American regionalism are less questioned by the nationalist right. They are only becoming less important in the foreign policy of the new right-wing governments. So I think now I have answered all the questions, so we can start now the debate with the audience, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Detlef. And indeed, there already are a number of questions that have been raised by the audience. And so I'll try to summarize them. And some of them, by the way, have been sent to me only individually and not to everybody. So you have, nobody else will see them. But I hope I'll do justice to all the questions that have arrived. Some are more kind of generally directed to all panelists, although by content, some of them kind of focus on the Latin American context mainly. And some are directed to individual speakers. And I will well, start with those that are already there, that have been there already now. So more general questions about Latin America. And one actually relates to the concept of liquid regionalism that Detlef has brought into the debate. It was kind of funny because this popped up in a chat like practically in the moment when you were talking about it, or even a bit earlier. So a contemporaneous coincidence, if you want. So this concept of liquid regionalism by Mariano and Bressan and Luciano, who have, by the way, published their article in the same special issue that our article that we mentioned at the beginning is also published in, as kind of an idea of regionalism with a low commitment of national states, national governments. So in that sense, quite pessimistic outlook, if to follow Detlef's interpretation of this as well. And this member of the audience asked, so that what could be an alternative proposal then? What can we kind of conclude from that? And is there a role for non-state actors, for civil society, in terms of regionalization, regional integration, strengthening regional cooperation? So that is one question, which I think also is kind of mostly thinking of the Latin American context, even though I think you could also generalize it to other regions. There was another question directed to Latin American experts in general, focusing on the potential impact of the Brazilian elections in 2022. And Detlef, you also mentioned that the current government in Brazil is not very interested in regional cooperation. So if we assume that there might be a change of government next year, do you think that could lead to a redirection of the agenda regarding regional cooperation and regional organizations? Then there are a few questions directed to Andres, particularly. One related to the concept of minilateralism, and focusing on these various kind of loose, informal acronym organizations such as BRICS, etc., which seem to relate more to the debate about global governance, or be a form of global governance, also because they transcend regions and are not focused on a particular region, but connect states from different regions. So looking at that concept kind of directs the attention away from regionalism, regional cooperation, and regional integration. So Andres, I think the question is, what do you think, how does that impact specifically on the perspectives of regionalism in Latin America? The rise of minilateralism, if you want. What will be the impact for regionalism in general, but particularly in Latin America? And another question to Andres was also related to infrastructure and the quality of infrastructure when we compare the global north and the global south. So can we say that, or would you say that the rather low quality of infrastructure, of connections via trains, etc., and roads in South America and the global south more generally has also contributed to the lack of integration in these regions? And a question to Andrea that has come in relates to the Organization of American States, and the question of how the Organization of American States has coped with the pandemic and also refugee issues. I think that relates to the Venezuelan context and the Venezuelan refugee crisis. So what do you think has the role of the OAS been in these crises, and what is the state of the OAS after these crises, or in the aftermath of this crisis? What will it be in the aftermath of these crises? And if I may, I will add, well, I may because I'm the chair, I will add a question to Thomas, because you mentioned all these various crises that the European Union has gone through. And in our kind of concept about regionalism under stress, we were also talking about and thinking about how could be the impact of subsequent stress situations. And that, of course, could go both ways. It could be that going through and not being able to cope well with a stress situation could then have a negative impact on subsequent stress situations, leave the organization in a weaker state than it was before, and even less able to focus on and tackle new stress situations. But it could also work the other way around, that regional organizations learn from previous stress situations and improve their mechanisms, improve their ways of coping, and thus are able to actually better face and more effectively manage subsequent stress situations. So how would you say has that been in the case of the European Union? Has there been something like institutional learning between the different stress situations that you mentioned? And I think that's already a lot of issues. I think I'll leave it here and hand back. I think we'll go again in the order of the presentations, and I give you the opportunity to answer these questions.
Good. So should I go, Britta? All right. Yeah, no, it's a lot indeed. I'm really happy with the other presentations as well. And I have a couple of questions also. Let me start with the OAS question. Well, I mean, technically speaking, I mean, when you talk about regional integration, OAS is a different kind of organization. But as I mentioned, even in health, I mean, it has been very important. So, but OAS has also suffered, I mean, from the times of the last decade, but also now, as you know, also Mexico has been pushing an agenda, as Detlef mentioned. I mean, it could be that it changes when the protoporic presidency changes, but even now, I mean, there's an agenda of pushing CELAC vis-a-vis OAS. So I would say that this polarization of ideologies that basically affected UNASUR and MERCOSUR, they also affected the OAS, and it's still there. Whether Venezuela was a cause or consequences, I mean, it's beyond here the analysis, but I mean, it's certainly an element of it. I mean, the radicalization of Venezuela is an element where we can see that how all these organizations, they were impacted, and that includes OAS. That said, I mean, I wanted to bring one regional aspect within the OAS and the IADB system, the Inter-American system. We have these development banks. We didn't mention them at all, but I've been working with that also in our Jean Monnet network. We published a book last year about it, and the idea is that even if these regional banks from the Andean community regionally, the CAF, but also certainly the IADB, and they have played a role in the region. However, despite the fact that they're regional banks, they don't have at the moment an agenda of regional integration as such, but they are relevant. I just didn't want to leave these completely out, because depending on how we define the role of the region here, I think this is an element that's very important. And they foster mostly cooperation like with countries, not really among them, the countries, but they foster kind of common initiatives, common ideas, but not implemented through regional organizations necessarily, but also, although sometimes they can also be used, of course, even in this COVID initiatives, resources from FOSEIN, for instance, from MERCOSUR, were used. So they can be sometimes, but of course, they alone as regional banks, they don't have a kind of a driving force for regional integration per se. I wanted to address one element. Maybe I didn't make myself clear, but I didn't say that the COVID strengthened regionalism. I mean, pretty much on the contrary, I concluded with the fact that even Mercosur, I'm very skeptical about the role of these organizations. These regional responses were very thin. As I said, they coordinated donations. They didn't have their own initiatives or all these attempts that were in the past, as I mentioned, like price negotiation or patent breaking and so on. They didn't take place. So my point was exactly how weak all these regional organizations were in the responses, and I just kind of tried to see, I think in Central America they were used, but again, not on their own initiative, just to transferring coordination. So my point was that health could be a seed, because it is, if you want to see from that point, it is a very functional element. I mean, there are the borders, there are the fluxes of people. Diseases also go through borders. So here we could see that cooperation in health can be one of the most basic kind of elements that could drive some element of cooperation. But I'm not even saying that in Mercosur. I'm very skeptical. I mean, as my point was actually that Bolsonaro's break of trust will oversee him. I mean, when that connects a little bit with the question about elections in Brazil, I'm pretty skeptical that even if there is, could be Lula, could be someone else with a project for Latin America, I mean, the break of trust was huge. I mean, Itamaraty is another institution. We don't have time to go over here, but Itamaraty is not the same anymore. And not are the politicians, and we could very happily talk about that in another occasion. But I don't think that even if Bolsonaro is gone, and I really hope he's gone, this will pick up so easily. And I just want to conclude with one thing that could be a question also to Andres, but just for you when you go to your questions, that about flows and rules. I mean, even if you think crime, Andres, as flows, I mean, and talking from Brazil, I think this is relevant. There is also attempts to control those crimes and rules. The question is whether they go regional or not. And I do not want to dismiss completely yet the role of militaries. In Brazil, they are everywhere in all institutions, from the environment to whatever health. So, I mean, to what extent, I mean, the creation of rules could be even worse. I mean, Condor, all these past experiences that we had during the dictatorship. So I want to be positive about this change of government in Brazil, but I mean, it's not yet done. And there are a lot of analysis in Brazil that the militaries occupied a place now that's not easy to roll back. They are in all different levels of the administration in the government as well. And anyone who comes will have to negotiate with them. So these rules could be also, I mean, of course, crime. And we know what is the narco traffic. Is it crime? Is it poverty? So we can go back to this old discussion in Colombia. And I mean, and just to finish then, we didn't talk at all about climate change, although this has been a key issue all over the world. We just finished COP. And I think dealing with climate change, such as health, can also be a functional area where regional organizations have to deal with that. They will have to do something. And we are bad with that in Latin America. There's never, even the OTCA, I mean, the Treaty of Amazon hasn't been really strong, but could be a seed also for the future. So I just want to conclude. I'm very skeptical, but I want to conclude with a positive note that health and maybe climate change could be small seeds for at least epistemic communities. And who knows, in 3 generations, not ours anymore, that could pick up as some initiatives. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And just to explicitly mention what you've actually done already in responding to Detlef, that you as speakers are, of course, also welcome to kind of engage with what the others have said. So over to Thomas.
Yeah, very briefly on the institutional learning side. And then I have another comment. It's more a comment or question on Latin America. So on the institutional learning side, the answer is yes and no. Yes, I mean, one interesting aspect is really the change that has gone on in European policies with the financial plus euro crisis. I kind of combined that in one. So, but Detlef, you're right. One needs to keep these things separate. But at that time, the richer European countries such as Germany, but also the Northern European countries were not prepared to bail out the debtor countries in Southern Europe, and that has completely changed during the COVID crisis. So it was, of course, justified on different terms. It has always to do with the question. So here I completely disagree with Andres. I think identity is front and center in actually also explaining variations. But my point being that the construction, at least in the European North during the Euro crisis, was that if countries in Southern Europe are themselves responsible for their economic and financial crisis, Northern Europe shouldn't bail them out. And COVID was, of course, a totally different situation. It was constructed very differently. That here you have to simply show solidarity. However, it has changed in a way the financial architecture in Europe. Also, the whole development toward a banking union is an institutional learning exercise. Where there is nothing going on is migration issues. They are as conflictual as they've been when they first popped up. We do not have a common migration policy in Europe, and it's very hard to deal with the rule of law crisis. Okay, so this brings me to my question to everybody else. Again, I find Latin America pretty puzzling in the sense of, and I now emphasize the half-empty glass. You could say, historically speaking, the inventor of regionalism and regional organization is Latin America. It's not true. Europe is not the inventor. They came later. The OAS is one of the oldest regional organizations. And a lot of the stuff, I'm currently reading the origins of the current international order. So I'm focusing a lot on Latin America and the role of Latin America. So Latin America in the 1930s, in the early 1940s, etc. There's a lot of efforts at regional integration. So in the way, they were really present at the creation of regionalism. And my question is to you who know Latin America way more than I do, what the heck happened? Yeah, is it the question? I mean, one possible hypothesis is simply the lack of stable liberal democracies. Yeah, in terms of the core powers. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the arguments that Ernst Haas made in the 1970s. That one of the preconditions why the Europeans could get their act together was that after World War II, the core powers in Europe, in Western Europe in this case, were pretty much consolidated democracies, you know. So that's one argument. But there are other arguments, etc. I just want to throw this to you.
Thank you, Thomas. And just to add for everybody that Thomas mentioned, he has to leave punctually. So just in case we go a couple of minutes over time, don't be surprised if he needs to unlog already a bit earlier. But I hope we wrap up after the round of discussion and be on time. But anyway, don't feel constrained by that in any way, please. So Andres, over to you.
Thank you, Britta. The first question is about the relationship between minilateralism and regionalism. And the most important point here is that minilateralism is about big countries. The smaller number of big countries that is enough to deal with the question. While regionalism is about big and small countries. There is no regionalism of big countries alone. So minilateralism is about setting countries aside, those that are smaller or less powerful. About the infrastructure, the role it had, or the consequences of poor infrastructure on regionalism in Latin America. 2 decades ago, I would have said that it was important because value chains and supply chains had some importance in Latin America. No longer now. We are trading with each other less than we were in the past. So if we had roads and trains and bridges and communication, there are no potential benefits from trade that we could reap from. So no, it's not about infrastructure. We want to sell and buy to China, from Europe, from the United States. It's not among us that we conduct businesses. It's not about infrastructure because neighbors do not need each other, at least as regards formal flows. And then it comes informal flows, the question by Andrea. Yes, militarization is one way of cooperation, the Plan Condor you mentioned. Another way is decriminalization, joint decriminalization. Uruguay is trying it alone, it's not going to work. But countries can do things together, and these things can be good or bad. The thing is that if they don't do things together, the cartels will. So the Primeiro Comando da Capital, Comando Vermelho, the cartels from Brazil are already operating, we know it, it's public, in Paraguay, in Argentina, and in the region. And they are very, very well connected with the regions or countries where drug is produced. So the drug business is already transnational at Latin American level, but rules are not. These rules can be good or bad, again, Andrea, but if we have no rules will be there and they will be implanted, they will be decided by the cartels as they are doing right now. So it's up to us to define the situation, and it's up to the government to decide whether they are going to act or not. Most probably they are not going to act. And so what we are going to see in Latin America is what we saw in Mexico in October 2019. They jailed, remember, Chapo Guzman's son, and then the cartel went out on a shooting out, and then the Mexican state had to kneel before the cartel and release Chapo Guzman's son. So the cartels are already stronger than the governments, are already stronger than the states. If the states do nothing about this, and there is this commission report by the United Nations headed by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Gaviria, and Cedillo 10 years ago that said, decriminalize, the war on drugs is lost. This is the key issue for Latin America. It's not about trade. Regionalism is about doing things against drugs, against the cartels. Otherwise, trade is with China. Drugs is among ourselves. This is the decision we have to make. This is not in the agenda. This is not what governments are discussing. The only one that put this on the table was Uruguay. Nobody is paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to Detlef.
Perhaps to answer to Thomas, we are also still puzzled with Latin America. This is the reason why we still continue doing research on Latin America. But I think one explanation might be that the economic leg was missing in Latin American regionalism from the beginning. I think there had been more economic integration in the 50s and 60s. But in a certain ways, all the commodities boom cycles were bad for Latin American regionalism. And I think we see this now again in the past decade. This might be one reason. And then perhaps we have also to look with regard to the power distribution, the competition between different countries in Latin America, and also to ask the question, what is the best grouping for regional integration. I think Mexico, in a certain way, is not economically is not part of Latin America. It's part of the North American economic zone. I think these are some points, but I think this will need more discussion. I think I have to say something also to Andres. I think you are overselling a little bit the dependency from China. Even if a Latin American country is trading 30% of its exports, or 35 with China, then still 65 or 70% is with other countries. I think trade dependency we have between Mexico and the United States. When a country is trading 80% with your neighbor, then you are dependent. But I think with certain 30 or 25 or 20%, you have still more options. This is a small footnote only to your presentation. The election in Brazil, I think what I said before, I think we have interpresidentialism in Latin America when the governments change and the president has a new orientation. Also, the orientation of the government in regard to economic or political integration might change. So in the case that Lula wins the election, I'm quite sure that Brazilian foreign policy in regard to the region will change. I do not think it will fall back to the golden times of Lula, because the economy has changed, as Andres has shown. When the first Lula government started, Brazil was still exporting manufactured products. Now it's basically much more exporting products from the primary sector. So it will not be the same. Then the question was about liquid regionalism. I think this is a good characterization. I think we can also discuss whether this old concept of post-hegemonic regionalism has still a value. I would say yes. There's no hegemonic model of regional organization in Latin America, and now with what Andrea mentioned, this competition between CELAC on the Organization of American States. There's also this more anti-hegemonic project, but I'm not sure whether CELAC will survive OAS or whether OAS survives. If I have to bet, I would bet on OAS or not on CELAC. I think this have been all the questions related to yes. Oh, Britta, did I forget something to answer?
No, I think you pretty much covered the questions. So thank you very much. And as I've also done a bit of work on Latin America, let me also make my attempt, and then maybe Andrea can also try to answer Thomas's question about the disappointing record of Latin America, if you want to put it like that. The former Secretary General of the OAS, Insulza, has once said about the Carta Interamericana, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, that this document is very strongly aspirational rather than kind of regulatory, although of course it does have some regulatory elements about what to do in certain situations and so on. But it paints kind of a certain ideal of what to achieve in the future. And I think this is something that is true for regional organizations in Latin America in general. Often the initial treaties or agreements have been very ambitious, knowing that it would take some time or maybe would never be achieved, or they would never get there to these aims or to these kind of depth of integration that was envisioned in these treaties. And so I think it's kind of, that might be an explanation. And then also, it's a bit of a gap, I think, between rhetoric and reality. And if we kind of just base the assessment of the state of regionalism or the contributions to regionalism of Latin America on the documents, that we might draw false conclusions. And we also kind of have to compare what is written in the foundational documents and in the treaties and what happens in reality. Now, I would like to give Andrea the opportunity to say something, and then Andres, I think, wants to comment as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's still also puzzling. But I do think there is an important thing about the economic changes. This changes not only for go back now in time to the export of agriculture and so on, but that of course being that being exported to China. In the case of Brazil, I think it's pretty serious. I don't know all the other countries. I mean, but where the impact has been arriving, and where I think there is a space for discussing it, is that what's the impact of all these exports of commodities and the impact of investments being done there in these areas. And I think here, that's why I want to put this thing of climate change again, because I think it's where it's possible to build a new consensus that if the impact of all these new economic patterns, it's so bad for the environment, it is, then something has to change. And then I don't know if this hegemony of China will hold, because if it's only about buying all these agricultural minerals and lithium and so on, then of course, I mean, then there's a problem. But if there is a consensus about dealing with that, and not only the regional level, that has to be done at the global level as well. And that's the tricky thing. I mean, then the crisis of multilateralism has a role in it as well. Then I think there could be a positive interface here with dealing with climate change multilaterally, but also regionally. And that would necessarily bring about another model of development. And CEPAL has been talking about it. There are discussions about how to change these patterns of this is the old Prebisch. It's ridiculous, but it's really the old Prebisch predictions. And then, of course, I think in terms of identity, I think that's one new element, because there's a lot of changes in the region. And if you look at now, I mean, after the ideological polarization, the debate about identities is not really Latin American identities or not. It's all these intersectionalities. What's so strong in Latin America now is identities not necessarily against regional identity, but this subdivision of national identities, intersectionality. I mean, the big debate in Brazil is about racism, is about indigenous groups. So, I mean, regionalism would have to reincorporate this dimension of identity, because so far you talk about cultural identity as if Latin American culture is homogeneous, and it's not. And so it's very fragmented, but I don't think it's impossible to rethink identity in those terms, about a less white identity like this. And this, so far, this has only caused division, I think, in the regional level. So all these movements, they are against regional integrations, for instance. That's what we see, be it Mercosur or UNASUR. I mean, even the left-wing organizations, even ALBA, I mean, that didn't really made a space. So I think it's an element to think about. I mean, if there is any kind of retake of regionalism, what is this Latin American identity, has to be a rethought as well. But I don't think that's the problem. I also disagree with Andres here. I don't think that's the problem, but I do think that this macro political economy situation is one of the big elements. That's why I'm moving a bit into the discussion of maybe going back to my own roots as an economist and going back to the political economy and real economy, not even political economy. But I think we'll be discussing that in the few months to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Andres, you wanted to react.
Thank you, Britta. I am sorry, I have to insist. The only thing Latin Americans have in common is identity. No common center of power, no common interests. It was just about identity, and identity is not enough to build a regional organization. It wasn't enough in the past, it is not enough now. No common power, no common interests. What we have in common now is threats, common threats. This is what can bring us together. No other thing. We don't do trade with each other. We don't do wars with each other. We only do crime with each other. And identity is not enough. So either we react to common threats or we don't. If we do, we may have good regionalism if we decriminalize, or bad regionalism if we go Plan Condor again. As to Detlef, you are absolutely right. China was my example, not my argument. My argument is that interdependence is extra-regional. So whether China or the United States, it's the same. You're right. It's about we don't do things with each other. We do things with extra-regional powers.
Thank you very much. And I think with this, we will have to wrap up. I think the discussion has provided us with a lot of food for thought among us and for the audience. And Thomas has to leave, unfortunately, but as I said, we are finishing now. So we have raised a number of questions related to factors that might lead to regionalism, that might strengthen regional cooperation, or that might weaken regional cooperation. We have some dissensus here, obviously, on certain issues, such as the question of identity. And there's also kind of divergent findings on whether common threats that states within a region are facing, or call them threats, call them stress factors, call them crises, whether they could bring a region together and strengthen cooperation, or whether they could also weaken cooperation or lead to a fragmentation of the regions. I think that depends a lot on, well, previous experiences, on what is already there in terms of institutional structure, maybe also on identity in a way or another. So we have to look at a different set of the various set of variables when we look at the strength of and want to explain the strength of regional cooperation in different regions. And what we've also seen that it's always valuable to compare within regions and across regions, and that even though we might not be able to kind of directly compare or learn from each other, we can always learn from the comparison, and not necessarily, which doesn't necessarily mean applying the same model to all regions, but kind of drawing the conclusions of what has gone wrong and what has gone good and fine in other regions. And I think with this, I would like to thank all our panelists, including Thomas, who has already left, Andrea, Andres, and Detlef. And of course, a big thank you also to the organizers and everybody working behind the scenes to make this event possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Also, Claudia.
Thank you.